As you know, we are actually picking this series up from previous discussion. We have considered the development of Christianity from its origins until the Middle Ages. And what I'm doing during this series is discussing how it is that the medieval approach to Christianity was changed by the Reformation initially, and then interacted with Roman Catholicism as a result of that. And as you have been here before know, I am considering Christianity as I would read any other religion. That is, I am looking at it as a system of interacting activities. Those activities are, on the one hand, ritual. Ritual is the means by which we usually recognize a religion as being similar to ours or different from ours. Along with ritual, there is also a well-organized understanding of ethics in any religious system of which I am aware. And then finally, there is also an account of meaning. That is, something that tells us what the meaning of our lives as human beings truly is. And what I find fascinating about religion, and the reason I kind of majored in it in the course of my lifetime, is that these three activities, ritual, ethics, and meaning, interact in such a way that if you change the one, the others are going to shift as well. Religions are amazingly stable for their practitioners, but religions are not static. Religions, in fact, can go through revolutions. And we're going to witness a revolution right now, beginning with what appeared to be a remarkably unmoving medieval synthesis of what Christianity was. The 16th century saw a remarkable new entity, Protestant Christianity. So we begin, as you see on page 1 in the top box, with an analysis of this medieval synthesis, beginning with what is most striking about medieval Christianity, and that is the number of sacraments. No, not just 7. 7 is the number of principal sacraments. Hugh of St. Victor counted up 84 sacraments. How can you have so many sacraments? Well, you add on, let's say, to baptism, also the churching of women when they are brought back into the community. You add on to the sacrament of penance, which we'll hear about further, a sacrament of anointing in order to be renewed with the Holy Spirit. You add on not only receiving the sacrament, but also the adoration of the sacrament. That you set up a host that's been consecrated, and you use that as a source of meditation and contemplative transformation. There's never been a time in the history of Christianity where there was more access to an experience of the holy than within the sacramental understanding of the Middle Ages. Middle Ages, among historians, frequently known as the Dark Ages. They call them dark, mostly because they don't understand them. And sure enough, there is a dearth of the kind of documentation we would like, but the fact is that the purpose of these sacraments was to bring light and illumination to as many people as possible. And the belief was that those who were so illuminated, those who had a sense of the presence of God, were able, and you'll see this in the first box as well, to make atonement in their lives for what had gone wrong. And this is the reason for which within the Middle Ages there is a great emphasis upon the reality of human sin. It goes beyond the biblical position. You know, the biblical position is quite straightforward. When people ask me why the Bible talks so much about sin, I always say, because there's a lot of it about. Just one of those realities you have to deal with. But during the Middle Ages, sin came to be understood as the principal human reality. So that you always had the question, how can I atone? How can I appease God for my sin? And the Middle Ages developed two principal means of that. Both of them are related to the way in which, during the Middle Ages, that's seen in the book of Genesis concerning Abraham and Isaac was understood. As you'll know, in Genesis chapter 22, Abraham goes up Mount Moriah in order to sacrifice his child. At the end, he doesn't do it. He's stopped by an angel. But there's an interesting seam in that story. And the seam is, because it combines two different sources, that at the beginning of the story, it says, God tested Abraham and said, go up the mountain, I will show you. But at the end of the story, it's not God who stops Abraham's hand. Instead, it's an angel. And this opened up a suspicion in the interpretation of Christianity, in the interpretation of Judaism, and in the interpretation of Islam. I dealt with that in an earlier book called Abraham's Curse. I know the price of that one. It opened the possibility that really God wanted this sacrifice to take place. And as a result of that, Isaac came to be seen as a figure of the ideal martyr. The young man, usually, going out to war. And in fact, when Pope Urban II, during the Middle Ages, preached the Crusades, what he explained was that those who took part in the Crusades would be forgiven their sins to that moment, and would be forgiven the sins that they would commit during the Crusades. Military action became a method of atonement on the alleged similarity between what the believing Christian did against the infidels and Isaac as God really had wanted him to be sacrificed. You may find it interesting that the teaching of jihad, as we have come to know it in Islam of late, only originated in conflict with the Crusaders. Prior to the Crusade, the concept that jihad is the greatest of all forms of atonement had not been in Islam. In an odd way, Christians actually contributed that by giving them something to react against. Now, of course, most people did not go on crusades, although, mind, hundreds of thousands did. Literally hundreds of thousands of people left where they lived ordinarily as entire families and tried to journey to combat the infidel. But although not everyone could do that, anyone could take part in a system in which they would atone for their sin by means of making pilgrimage, by means of donations to the building, say, of St. Peter's Cathedral. And the concept was that although human sin had become anthropologically the first reality, there was a way that you could overcome it by means of atonement and guided by the sacraments, so that ultimately you could join in saying the creeds of orthodoxy and understand that when they refer to the resurrection of the dead, those creeds were talking about you. So it was a very powerful, influential system that Martin Luther confronted at its most vulnerable point, at precisely the point that it spoke of how it is that human sin could be overcome. So I have quoted the first 7 of what we usually call his 95 Theses. He didn't call it that. He just called it Disputation on the Power and Efficacy of Indulgences. He was looking at the teaching of atonement as it applied to the concept that human beings could overcome their sins by going on a pilgrimage, by acquiring the relic, the remains of a saint, and showing devotion to that, or by making a devotion to the church. I find it interesting that he really manages to encapsulate his entire position in his first 7 statements. He's against the idea of the 7 sacraments, but he's still thinking that way, if you look at it. And so he wrote, when our Lord and Master Jesus Christ said, repent, he called for the entire life of believers to be one of penitence. In other words, it's not a momentary ritual. It's an entire disposition in life. He goes on, the word cannot properly be understood as referring to the sacrament of penance, i.e., confession and satisfaction as administered by the clergy. Yet, he goes on, its meaning is not restricted to penitence in one's heart. A very interesting statement. It is not restricted to penitence in one's heart. Feeling personally sorry is not penitence any more than merely going through a ritual is penitence. He goes on, for such penitence is null unless it produces outward signs in various mortifications of the flesh. And 4, as long as self-hatred abides, i.e. true inward penitence, the penalty of sin abides until we enter the kingdom of heaven. Forgiveness is about overcoming guilt as well as being released from sin. And then, in number 5, the rubber hits the hierarchical road. The Pope has neither the will nor the power to remit any penalty beyond those imposed either at his own discretion or by canon law. That is to say, the Pope does not have theological power to authorize the sale of indulgences, or even to give a general indulgence, such as, I have to say, the Pope does today. When he offers what's called a plenary indulgence, that means that everyone who engages in a particular act is offered forgiveness for what is called sins which are not mortal. They're important, but an indulgence will permit you to be released from purgatory earlier than you would have been otherwise. The Pope does not have jurisdiction in purgatory, according to Martin Luther. He believed that he did have jurisdiction in Italy, but not in purgatory. Of course, in the 19th century, the Pope lost it in Italy too, but he still got it in the Vatican. Number 6 pursues this same thought. The Pope himself cannot remit guilt, but only declare and confirm that it has been remitted by God. Or at most, he can remit it in cases reserved to his discretion. Except for these cases, the guilt remains untouched. And because he believes that forgiveness involves release from guilt as well as release from sin, the issue of where you get past that is very important for Luther. And so he says, God never remits guilt to anyone without at the same time making him humbly submissive to the priest his representative. So Martin Luther still expects his people to come to confession, but he understands their relationship to be one of enduring penitence, release from sin, and at the same time, release from guilt. In order for him to pursue this, he has, as a matter of logical consistency, to pursue his claims against the papacy until Pope Leo, as I discussed last semester, can't stand it anymore and issues the encyclical Exsurge Domine, Arise, O Lord, let your enemies be scattered. And he had in mind Martin Luther. And his sense that Luther was directly opposing his system of religion was entirely accurate. Why? Take a look now at the box on the bottom of page 2. What Martin Luther had started to do and would be continued throughout the history of Protestantism to this day. Do bear in mind that my aim in this series is to speak of the practice of Christianity in the modern world. So I'm interested in Luther's system as it was accepted and embraced and developed further and is still practiced. At the very center of this system is the understanding we are going radically to reduce our understanding of the number of sacraments. Forget about 84. Forget about 7. Luther himself says, okay, I'll grant you 2. What are the 2? Eucharist, or Lord's Supper, and baptism. And he refers to those 2 because those are actually rituals that were instituted by Christ within the Gospels. But actually, there's even a more telling analysis which is expressed by Luther in the very first of his statements. The entire life of obedience is what a sacrament truly is, which means that within a Protestant construction of Christianity, there's only one true ritual, and that is faith itself. And that is the reason for which Luther himself took a statement of St. Paul's, Paul himself then quoting the scripture of the prophet Habakkuk, the just person shall live by his faith. The understanding is that faith itself is the entire focus of our activity. It's for precisely this reason that Protestant churches are plainer than Catholic churches. Well, except this one, but Episcopalians can't figure out which one they are, so I wouldn't take this as the norm of anything in particular. Episcopalians are, shall we say, a very small hybrid lot. But if you look at the Quaker Meeting House, if you look at the Congregational Church of the 18th century, and you compare that to the aesthetics of the Roman Catholic Counter-Reformation, you can tell that there's something different going on. And what is different going on is that you have an approach to God through faith being insisted upon among Protestants, while with equal insistence, a Catholic point of view derived from the Middle Ages is insisting upon the sacraments. So of course, if you believe that sacraments are what bring about an approach to God, you're going to want to multiply them. And medieval Christians did. But if you believe that it's actually faith that brings about that affinity to God, then you're going to become extremely skeptical about sacraments, about images of saints, and everything associated with that worship. Cromwell really did bring canon into Ely Cathedral, where I was ordained a priest in England, and he did shoot the saints out of their niches with his canon. You can still see the cannon scars in the walls of the cathedral. You know what the British are about maintenance. So there is a profound sense in which these are not merely changes. One is willing to go to war over the question, what brings you nearer to God? Because in Luther's construction, this unique focus upon faith as being the ritual that matters means that then, as a matter of ethics, what you are actually putting into effect is salvation itself by the way in which you act. This is one of the distinctive understanding of Protestant ethics. Ethics don't come, in this view, because you are working your way into favor with God. Instead, the understanding is you have experienced God's grace by means of your faith, and that grace is transforming you and causing you to act in the appropriate way. That is the Lutheran understanding of what orthodoxy truly is. And it's interesting that just as within Protestantism, ritual is radically reduced to the very point of faith, so orthodoxy actually becomes somewhat more elastic. It is not only Orthodox creeds, it's also a thorough reading of St. Augustine, in whom Luther was an expert, and John Calvin was probably a greater expert. Many of the thoughts that are present in Protestant Christianity were there in the Church Fathers and rediscovered by the Reformers because they were people of the Renaissance. They had deliberately gone back, mastered more ancient languages than most of their contemporaries, and so mined orthodoxy for what they felt was the true meaning of this faith. And they saw it in terms of their direct opposition to what had emerged during the medieval synthesis. That opposition, as I mentioned, resulted in violence, not only at a local level, shooting the saints out of their niches, but at a national level. So if you look over on page 3, I just take one verse from the Revelation of John, which turned out to be pivotal during the 16th and the 17th centuries. In 11:5, the angel trumpeted, and there were loud voices in heaven, saying, "The kingdom of the world has become the kingdom of our Lord and his Messiah, and he will reign forever and ever." Martin Luther went through what you might describe as a conversion after his conversion. His big conversion was to the concept that the just person will live by faith alone. But his other conversion, his little conversion, concerned the revelation of John, the Apocalypse. When he first wrote a preface to the Apocalypse, because he translated the entire New Testament and the whole of the Old Testament, I said he was a man of the Renaissance. Fine translation in the Luther Bible. When he did that, he wrote of the Revelation, "I don't like this book." He was not a man to mince words. "I don't like this book. I'm not sure where Christ speaks in it. And I'm really confused. No one in the book really tells me what the visions are about. And in the end of the book, it says you have to keep the words of the book." He said, if I could understand them, maybe I'd keep them. But I don't get it. He did not object to it as much as he objected to the Epistle of James, which he called an epistle of straw, but he really didn't like it. Then in 1530, 8 years later, he writes, "This is a great book." And you think, why does he love this thing so much? Because, he wrote, the Antichrist is predicted in it. And the Antichrist, you know who the Antichrist is. And he set in motion an entire movement of interpretation. especially in Puritan circles, that looked ahead to the defeat of the Pope as the Antichrist as when the millennium of the saints would be initiated. So I refer to a book called Revelation of Revelation, written by Thomas Brightman in 1609, very influential work. And he identified this text, Revelation 11:5, with Queen Elizabeth I's ascendancy of the throne, because, he wrote, she gave herself and her kingdom to Christ by way of thankfulness, which she showed by rooting out the Roman superstitions. And he believed that in his time, with the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588, a completely unexpected victory for the British. The Armada had come from defeating the entire Muslim fleet in the Mediterranean, and yet foundered in the English Channel. We all know what weather could do. Others were surprised. This was taken to be providential. It meant that the Antichrist was finally going to be destroyed. Of course, it must be borne in mind that there was another side to this argument about the revelation and about what true Christianity was. In fact, Thomas Brightman wrote his book in order to dispute with a cardinal named Robert Marlemene, who was a member of the Inquisition, a good friend of the popes of his time, voted for the execution of Giordano Bruno, and informed Galileo that he could live in peace, but not publicly. He also believed that he had the true interpretation of the apocalypse. You know the number of the beast? 666. Add those numbers up. Show how they relate to letters. They spell out an obvious name, said Marlemene. It's Martin Luther. So how that argument turned out, we'll see next week. Thank you very much indeed. I dare to speak about Martin Luther in the presence of Al, and therefore I have to ask Al for his question.
No,
yeah.
just a footnote.
Yeah.
I think we have, I want you to make a distinction between Luther's position with the statues and other Protestants, let's say. Because we have the word adiaphora, which simply means it really doesn't matter. So therefore, for instance, in the, quote, the Lutheran churches, all the icons and statues and so on can be helpful for faith and learning and so on. So in other words, I don't think, in fact, Luther protested those who wanted to shoot down, destroy the statues. That's all my,
No, I think it's a very good point, Al. Thank you very much. Once these principles are out, they always have to be negotiated in order to understand how they're going to be put into effect. For example, this church has one or two stained glass windows. It is very much unlike other churches of its time. It's built in a style which is called Carpenter Gothic. That is, it is picking up some of the aesthetic of the medieval period and rendering the whole in wood. Yet if you look behind me, if ever the Cardinal of Red Hook will take down his green screen, if you look behind me, although you have a sanctuary in a very clear Gothic style, you will also see that it is not set up for some of the distinctive practices of the Middle Ages, adoration of the Holy Sacrament, reserving a great deal of sacrament, or having a sanctuary light to signify the presence of Christ. The community over a period of time made its decisions about what you rightly call adiaphora, that is, those things which do not have value in themselves, but if you believe they're helpful to worshipers, you may authorize them. But that's a far cry, very far cry, from saying the stained glass window is a sacrament. The distinctive Protestant position is, if you begin from the view that faith alone is your lens, then you might also find a window, a statue, a practice to be valuable. But if you found it not to be so, then you would step back from it. And so Protestants did vie with one another to try to determine, should we go the way of the Quakers for plainness? Should we go the way of the Anglicans, who apparently say you can do anything Catholic you like as long as you don't mean it? Or are you saying that you need to find some middle way? The view that faith alone doesn't matter as long as anything else gets in its way, that faith alone has to be released, and that the whole of the human being has to be involved in this act of faith, then raises the question, well, the human being has to be involved in the act of faith in relation to what? So, Luther still wants you to make your confession to your local parish priest. Most Protestants don't do that. Most of them would see their distinction from Catholicism in not engaging in that practice. What's going on? These individuals are making a call about the relationship between their total dedication of faith and particular practices. But the standard is what promotes that faith. The standard is not the practice in itself. You know, the Catholic position, which we'll see next week, is no, these are the seven sacraments. If they're not practiced, you're not a church. That kind of enumeration is not a likely way in which a Protestant will adjust. Yes, please.
The question of the response to the arts in the Protestant movements. There's a variation you see in the Lutheran side and the Episcopal side. They're not at variance with the arts, and then you see in other movements a desire to completely evacuate that. Yeah.
Exactly. That's right. You see that. And in fact, that is resuming an early tendency. Oh, I'm going to repeat your question now because I didn't do it for the tape. No, it's not your fault. It's totally mine. That you, as you rightly say, you have differing attitudes towards the arts within differing kinds of Christianity. And actually, this goes back a very long time. There was something in the 7th century called the iconoclastic controversy. And this took place not in Germany in the 7th century, but rather mostly in Constantinople, where local Christians took it into their heads that people who had set up shrines of the Virgin Mary and local altars outside the churches were really not extending their devotion. They were engaging in superstition. So when they said iconoclastic, they really meant icon busting. The true theologically correct monks took it into their hands to destroy the local shrines which were in and around Constantinople. This caused a spot of bother. And in fact, you may well ask the question, why, when you look at the mastery, and it is true mastery in my opinion, of icons in the Orthodox tradition, if you look at the Greek and the Russian conventions, what is the reason for those conventions? Why are they so unlike the naturalistic representations that you're inclined to see in the West? The reason for it is the iconoclastic controversy. Out of that came the view, yes, there are valuable icons. We're going to set up a very clear principle that says that when you venerate an icon, by the principle of what they call latria, what's going on is that your worship is going to God. It is not going to that object. And we're going to show this fact because we're not going to have them outside, away from the church. We are also going to incorporate them within the worship of Eucharist, so everyone knows what they're related to. And we'll also establish conventions for how they are made so that no one mistakes the image for the reality itself. So in the icon, there is always a deliberate step away from anything that you could call naturalistic representation. Now, because in the West, we didn't consciously go through that. I mean, during the 7th century, most of our ancestors were still daubing themselves with purple paint, so it wasn't a matter that they were keenly involved with. But later, they had to confront much the same question, and they did so at the time of the Reformation. The way in which we cope with it was not so much in artistic convention as in dealing with the question of how the worshiper adjusts to that object. Yes, please, David.
Yeah. I have to just say, as a personal note, that I think that the whole issue of sacraments and liturgy is a very alive issue today. And that you mentioned about how religions change and the means of sacrament and liturgy change. And then the other point, given that in my own personal perspectives, in a way, if you say, well, we're not going to do sacraments, right, you're kind of stuck, because what is the liturgy after all? But the final sacrament, the entire liturgy, you go through this process. You come here, you sit down, there's a person, Bruce Chilton, he gets up, he does stuff, and I do this every week. And if sacraments don't really have much meaning, and I live by faith alone, why should I bother to show up?
And this is always an argument, isn't it? You probably have heard the question, isn't it the same if I garden and think about God?
Exactly.
I say no.
There you go. I mean,
But I would make a distinction.
Yeah.
I would make a distinction between the act of worship,
Yes.
which by its very nature is collective, and any particular ritual. I would suggest that worship, in its relationship to other people, brings about dimensions which are simply not present when one is on one's own. I mean, being on one's own is fine too, but if you're asking the question, isn't that the same as collective worship? The answer is no, and it can't be. Just as thinking your own thought is your own thought. If you ask me, well, isn't it the same thing if I just repeat what Glenn Beck says? No, it really isn't. And not only, even if you improve the source, it wouldn't change the dynamic. There's a question at the back.
I have a question and also a comment. In terms of first, I'll give you the comment because it refers to what you just said. I'm a Quaker, and the act of worship is the total collectivity. It's nothing but us sitting together, period. My question, however, is what's the role of literacy in determining the importance of liturgy?
Excellent. Very, very good question, and it will actually link back also, I think, to David's. The role of literacy in this whole period of the 16th century is vital. There were people who had translated the Bible before into the vernacular. They were burned. One of them, Wycliffe, was burned after he died. That's an indignity, having your bones dug up so they could be burned. There were people who had engaged in reform before Luther. In fact, Luther should not be regarded as some kind of solitary genius. He was influential because he is bringing together many aspirations of the previous 15th century and is putting them into a movement. And he's doing it with appropriate protection and backing, both by local power brokers, the local electors, for example, in Saxony, thought this worked out really quite well because he was supporting both local power and the view that there should be a degree of autonomy for those who were German speakers. And this principle would be repeated by other Protestant leaders elsewhere. But then Luther required enormous popular backing. And he could write hymns, and he could do translations. And when he wanted to attack someone, you would read that tract with great enjoyment because it was a wonderful piece of work, just absolutely extraordinary in its vicious rhetoric and its analysis. And there was a kind of joyfulness about Luther in disputation that still comes right up off the page. And there was movable type. You could print this relatively cheaply. Now, there's something interesting here. Movable type had been developed before Luther. It was around, but there wasn't that much of a market for it. Why? If you really wanted to have a splendid, expensive volume, you would still do it in the old manner. That would give you a short print run, a highly expensive book. The printer would make the profit. But Luther's tracts weren't produced that way. They were produced for anyone who wanted to read 20, 30, 40 pages. He actually increased literacy in Germany ahead of its time. And his work was the first, second, and third bestseller in German letters for the first 80 years of German printing. And he made movable type profitable because you had enough going on. Now, that same principle followed the Reformation wherever it went. It resulted in a vast increase in literacy, which ultimately had an impact on liturgy. I eventually got to your question. It eventually had an impact on liturgy, chiefly through the influence of Thomas Cranmer, who was Archbishop of Canterbury and as such wrote the first English prayer book, but he didn't just do that because he was Archbishop of Canterbury. He'd been a professor at Cambridge for many years before that and had studied liturgy as his principal occupation for most of his life. And he introduced the idea that the congregation at worship and also reading would be able to attain a greater focus than would be possible otherwise. At a much later stage, and this goes back to David's observation, at a much later stage in the 20th century, which I'll barely get to this spring, but I'll get to next autumn, I promise. By the 20th century, we went through another liturgical renewal. And in fact, we are still in the midst of it. The person principally responsible for that was also principally responsible for the growth of interest in mysticism during the 20th century. It's Evelyn Underhill. And in fact, I will be arguing when we meet again in the autumn that Underhill's work shows us more than that of any other theologian where Christianity is headed after we get through this remarkably bumpy period we're in right now. Yes, please.
Do you believe that Luther was either aware of or consciously trying to parallel Jesus' supposed reformation of a multiplicity of laws down to two? And Luther was doing the same thing with the sacraments, back to two?
Mm-hmm. I think that the symmetry between two sacraments, two laws, is quite striking. And that may well have been one of the influences on Luther. Although the principal influence on him is clearly St. Paul, together with his reading of Augustine. I think those two people together did more than anyone else to influence his entire temperament. Also, if you read Paul and you read Luther, you would think they were brothers. there's a kind of temperamental affinity which is really quite striking. They both are dedicated practitioners of their own anger when they're crossed. They are highly volatile in their reactions. And at the same time, they are remarkably sensitive. And this very interesting combination is striking in the two of them. It is one reason, I suspect, that Luther was actually drawn to Paul's writing. He could see a personality there very much like his own. Yes, please, Trevor.
Hi. Yeah, I don't know whether I was misinterpreting, but when you said that during the Crusades, there was kind of a predispensation for sins, does that mean they would kind of give, the Crusaders were given like a get out of jail card, and they could do whatever they wanted?
This is a very good way of putting the arrangement of the indulgence during the crusade, a get out of jail free card. It's grace, what I have also called preemptory grace. That is, before you've done anything wrong, that which you might do wrong is being overlooked. And the impact of that plenary indulgence, I would have thought, even at the time it was articulated by Pope Urban II, was obvious. I mean, you're going to tell adolescent young men whatever you have done or might do during this campaign is okay. I mean, you thought spring break was a problem. The atrocities that occurred during the Crusades were just dreadful. And they had to do with a combination of this indulgence, which was clearly a bad idea, and also the fact that you were sending out people who were largely untrained. Pope Urban was perhaps hoping for 25,000 people to send to the Holy Land. The estimate is 120,000 people showed up in Constantinople. People just massively leaving their homes, mostly their farms. The great majority of them are peasants. And they go. And they try with different means what they can do in order to terrorize the Muslims on the way in. And one of their favorite methods was to behead a few people and then catapult the heads into the city. The hope is you frighten people and then they'll give up. Right? Like you show how compassionate you are. So that didn't work out too well. And guess what? The opposing Muslim forces figured out you can do the same thing. And that's one of the reasons for which, even given the primitive level of the technology of warfare, the Crusades took an enormous number of lives. I've said that there were about 120,000 people who showed up in Constantinople. And that's the count of the Byzantine princess who was there. So she had some means to judge the number of people. Of them, 8,000 actually took Jerusalem. The others deserted, were killed, were scattered. It was an enormous dislocation. And finally, on that occasion, they took Jerusalem, again with enormous bloodshed. There are chroniclers at the time who refer proudly to crusaders going up to the Temple Mount, as it is today, and filling it with blood. And then, the chroniclers say, they went to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and in their blood-stained uniforms celebrated the Mass. In their minds, this was an achievement of atonement.
We're still doing this in Abu Ghraib.
Yes, that's right. Many of the adjustments towards warfare, which we presently have, for example, the idea that when a soldier suffers, that soldier's suffering is a sacrifice and it's noble. Even if he does wrong, we still have the concept of the get-out-of-jail-free card. where it occurs, where it concerns warfare. We're still living, and this is one reason I'm doing these lectures. These systems never go away. They're always present in one form or another, giving you this conception that somehow it is necessary for you to make sure that in times of conflict, you do send your child to warfare. It's the right thing to do. If you didn't, you would somehow not be being faithful. Where does that come from? I suggest it comes from this understanding of atonement, which we have inherited from the Middle Ages. So although my focus today is on the Reformation, it's not to say that it therefore blots out what goes before. No, it is simply another system of Christianity which has its own influences and which can have its own excesses, as can any system of religion that we encounter. Yes, please.
Are you saying about the story of the Ikeda that the angel rebelled against God, perhaps?
The understanding would be that the angel, right, the question is, would that mean in the case of the Akedah, Genesis 20, this is for Fred, it's not for you. In Genesis 22, you have God commanding Abraham, go to the mountain, and you have the angel grabbing Abraham's hand with the knife in it. So what does it mean for there to be that variation? Is, in fact, the divine intent that this should really happen? Interpreters in the time of the Talmud say, actually, Abraham went through it. He killed Isaac, reduced him to ashes, because it was a burnt offering, and then God raised him up. So the angel then is brought in as if there'd been a time lapse, and the divine will had been fulfilled, but then Isaac had been restored. And this same interpretation in the Talmud also tells us that it is perfectly obvious that Isaac at this time must have been 37 years old.
Yeah, there's a problem.
He's a fully grown adult, although in the text of Genesis 22 he's called a yeled, he's called a boy. And I think he must be about 9 years old, because any older he would have objected. There are some interpretations that make Isaac an adolescent. That's not plausible. Yes, please, Isabel.
Should I ever speak to Luther now? Can I ask him if I could have my own relationship with God, that I wouldn't want to go through him necessarily?
Well, excellent, right. You want to say to Luther, I think this personal relationship to God stuff is good, but I don't necessarily want to do it with you as my priest, as you insist. Well, this is why the Protestant Reformation went differing ways over precisely the question, what kind of role do the clergy have in relation to grace? There were others. For example, Luther had a student, a very talented student, whose name was Thomas Müntzer, who argued that not only was the Pope not authorized to get into the forgiveness business, neither were the clergy. And by the way, bishops are a really bad idea, and we don't need wealthy landowners to be magistrates. He became a leader in what is usually called the Peasants' War, against which Luther himself wrote vehemently. He actually tried at first to speak moderately, and then it didn't work out. And then after he wrote his pamphlet, which was called Against the Rioting Peasants, a publisher decided he had to, brighten up the title, and so he made it Against the Murdering Riotous Peasants. That was the most important revolt in Europe until the French Revolution. And it took thousands and thousands of casualties. So yes, one of his own students read that, listened to Luther, and came to exactly the same conclusion, namely, if you're against papal hierarchy, you should be against all forms of hierarchy. That was why at the time of the Civil War in England, the decision was made, backed by the propagandist for the Puritans, whose name was John Milton, right? That was his day job, long before Paradise Lost and all that. He's a propagandist for Cromwell. And he argues for the beheading of Charles I. You have to get rid of that king if you actually believe that human beings are in the image and likeness of God. Then there's no such thing as a king who bears that image and likeness more. The only way to show that, the only way to show that we are made in God's image to act collectively is to kill the king. He wrote a pamphlet called On the Tenure of Magistrates and Kings in the same year that Charles I was killed, in order to make your point. So you and John Milton share that point of view. And once it was applied to the king, then Parliament also said, by the way, this bishop stuff is crazy. So we're also going to get rid of bishops. And they did. They were gone. There was no difficulty about it. And further, they looked at this view of Thomas Brighton that said that the English victory over the papacy was going to mark the millennium, and they commissioned someone to translate a work by a scholar named Joseph Mead, which set out the dating of when that was going to occur. This work was translated by an act of Parliament by a parliamentarian. And this kind of apocalyptic speculation of when the papal Antichrist was going to be defeated was a part of British national policy. Don't you want to know what the Catholics had to say about that? They had a few words which we'll get into next week. Of course, yeah. Yes, please.
What's the difference between the Protestant concept of grace and the Catholic concept of this time? Or was there any?
In both, the question is of the issue of grace in its relation to faith. In Luther's conception, and he is here a very keen reader of Paul, the very act of faith comes about as a result of grace. Now, what exactly does he mean by that? What he means is that a human being left to his or her own devices doesn't have a clue, doesn't understand, has no intimation of God. How, therefore, does faith arrive? In Luther's understanding, relying on Paul, faith comes about because you're aware of the grace of God. The term grace, charis, in Greek, literally means gift. And the idea is that you have a gift of God's presence that makes you both aware of God and that causes you to trust in God. When that occurs, you believe. Now that analysis of how it is that faith emerges from grace was actually accepted by the Roman Catholic Church, but it was accepted by them in 1962. In other words, there was agreement that this is how Paul understands faith and how, therefore, faith might be more generally understood. But you can also understand faith not in that sense, but rather simply to mean your agreement to certain propositions, your belief in the creed, for example. Luther makes a distinction between faith, which sometimes is referred to as belief in, and your assent that something exists, your belief that. So I'd suggest that the principal difference between the two perspectives is whether the emphasis falls on the belief in, this is the grace movement that Luther refers to, or belief that, namely your assent to some propositions. I think I should stop now, and we can pick up our discussion afterwards. Thank you very much.